Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to Dinosaur Gaming, where we learn to be a better player. Today we're going to start a new series and we're going to talk about deck building, how to make a deck from scratch yourself to compete with everybody else. So this past weekend, as many of you know, was the pre-release weekend, pre-launch event for Jump To Lightspeed Set 4 of Star Wars Unlimited. And most people have already gotten their hands on their new fresh cards, playing all of their sealed events, their draft events, and now it's almost time to jump in to premium. But as you all know, first, in order to play the game, you need a deck. And of course, you can always get online, see what decks other people have made. There is absolutely nothing wrong with net decking. In fact, it is highly encouraged, especially if you're new to the game. But if you want to build a deck that's not predictable, if you want to be the one to create the deck that everybody else wants to play, well, we're going to talk about how to get there today. All right, so let's just jump right in. Before we start, I'm going to show you the three main tools that I use to build a deck from scratch. So the first one is going to be swoo-db.com. This is a fantastic database, and one of the best features is the advanced search. Based on what deck you're going to make, you can look for certain cards. You can see them all in one place. A great way to find cards that will synergize with what you are trying to do. We'll come back to this because we're going to use it quite a bit during this video. Second of all, of course, a great shout out to Swoo Competitive Hub. The lovely folks who maintain this have a great website where they keep track of all tournament results, deck lists, the meta, anything you want. But for what's most important for me is tournament results, where you can go in. Obviously, we're not going to see anything from Set 4 as it hasn't officially launched yet. But if you just take a look at what it looks like, you get to filter by event, see what's winning, what's not, and for most of them, you get to actually see what deck lists they're running, and that is very important when you're making your own deck, because you need to see what decks you are going to play against and what you need to beat. And finally, the third is SwooDB itself, swoodb.com, and that is what we will be using today to actually make the deck. So what deck are we making today? We're going to start off this series with Captain Phasma. So before we jump in, I'm going to say the reason why we are picking Captain Phasma is because it's a brand new set. We don't yet know what the meta will look like. Of course, we have an idea based on what we've seen in Set 3. We know that there's going to be a fair bit of, maybe not dominance, but there's going to be an edge if you're playing Han 1 Yellow, or if you're playing Django. They are old decks that have been tested. We know they're good, and they're just getting even more good tools in this set. Now, that doesn't mean they can't be beaten. But yeah, the main reason is because we don't know what the meta is, and when you're jumping into a fresh meta, you want to be playing something that is more proactive, not something reactive. The reason why at the beginning of every set, usually the aggro decks tend to dominate. Of course, we had Sabine in Set 1. We had a bit of Kylo dominance in Set 2. It happens quite a bit, and the reason is that for control and sometimes mid-range to thrive, they need to know what cards to put into their deck to counter the aggro. But if the aggro decks aren't yet determined, it is very hard to counter something that you don't know. You might have a whole set of removal that is just irrelevant. There's no point in running Felder Dragons if your opponent doesn't play anything that has 5 attack or more. Same thing goes with some of the removal in this current set that's very focused on vehicle. If your opponent's not running any vehicles and your deck has 10 things to deal with vehicles, well, it's not going to go very well for you. So we're deciding to make something a bit more proactive, something that is less about dealing with what's on your opponent board, but more about posing problems yourself and hoping that your opponent cannot deal with them. Second of all, this is a personal favorite leader of mine, and I love how she plays, and I love the concept of First Order. And of course, being a tribal leader, the difficulty of deck building is a lot lower than it would be for some of the more complex leaders or some of the more not obvious ones. So let's jump right in. Captain Phasma, On the leader side, it says action tap. If you played a first order card this phase, deal 1 damage to a base. It says a base. You could do it to your own base. There's no reason to do so. And of course, she flips on 5 resources and becomes a 4/6 that says on attack, if you played another first order card this phase, you may deal 1 damage to a unit. If you do, deal 1 damage to a base. Some people were unsure about the wording. This simply means that she doesn't count herself as being played. As long as you played any other first order card this phase, you get to do 2 damage, 1 to base, 1 to unit. Herself being a 5 cost 4/6, very good stat line for the 5. Not much else to say. She's pretty good. Not necessarily easy to deal with. There's not much that can deal with a 4/6 on resource turn 5, at least not easily, unless they're already winning the ground arena. So considering that this is a tribal leader, as we see that she really wants you to play first order cards. So the first thing we're going to do is check out what we have available as first order. So we came to SWDB here. We're going to go on to advanced, and this is the way I do it. Of course, there's, I'm sure, dozens of other ways to look into this. But all right, so let's go first order. Doesn't matter what color we're looking for at the moment. We just want to see what we have available. And if we sort by aspect, okay, we can see there are quite a few in red. Of course, we're going to ignore Kylo Ren leader or Von Reg. We're not playing another leader. We're playing Phasma. And there's a good chunk in green as well. Not many in blue. Of course, there are some very small options, but considering that Phasma herself is red, we need to pick a secondary color. It's most likely going to be green here because of the sheer number of stuff that we have. Of course, blue is viable. That said, the cards themselves that are in blue, Snoke does not tend itself to being a more aggressive deck, which Phasma is trying to do. Tam could work, but would you play an entire off color just for one card? I don't think so. With the same reasoning as Snoke, we're gonna completely disregard Finalizer. An 11 cost ship hasn't really been seen in competitive in the first place. I don't think that first order tag with Phasma is gonna be what pushes over the edge, but that's okay. So otherwise, we see that red green is a good combination. So now we're gonna come over to SWDB. We're gonna pick Phasma. We're going to pick a base. We said we're going to pick a green base. They'll have plenty of options. Let's start off with a basic 30 base, and then we'll see if we want to change it later. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to get all those first order cards that we saw, and we're going to put them in here before we start filtering anything out. Let's see what we have to work with. So without even looking at what the cards do, let's just throw them all in there. Of course, we're not going to put Finalizer, as we mentioned earlier. All right, so that's already 39 cards. That is a big chunk of the deck. Now, that doesn't mean we're going to be playing all of these, but it is a solid place to start. So let's go over the cards really quickly and see what they do. I'm not going to go too much into detail. We're just going to see if we're keeping them or not. So first things first, we have a 1-drop, first order Stormtrooper. On attack, when defeated, deal an indirect damage. Very aggressive, very good. It's very, very close to being what Death Star Stormtrooper was, which is a 3-1 for 1. Except if this dies, it also does no damage anyways. Not much else to say. Pretty good. We'll keep it in. Indoctrinated Conscript is a 1-cost 1/2. Not the best stat line. Could be piloted for 1 to give a vehicle 1/2. It has potential. However, paying 1 for just 1/2 in stats, whether that's as an upgrade or as a unit, is not generally good value. And I don't know. For now, I'm unsure about this. Let's go ahead and throw it into the sideboard. We'll look at it later. Next up, we've got Allegiant General Pride. All right, 2/3. 2 positive effects. If you have the initiative, deal 2 indirect damage to a player on attack. And then if for some reason that indirect damage hits a unit, you get to defeat an upgrade on it. Decent, not much to say. You need turn 1 plays, and this is a 2/3 for 2. We'll keep it in. General Hux. This is, I believe, the key card to this deck. It says each other first order unit gets raid 1. And action, if you played a first order card this phase, you get to tap him to draw a card. Now, a more aggressive deck like Phasma that has a lot of low-cost cards. I'm sure you guys noticed that most of our cards cost 3 or less, with a very, very few exceptions. If you're constantly playing low-cost cards, you're going to run out of cards. And in an aggro deck, when you run out of cards, when you run out of steam, that's when your opponent can actually turn the corner, take control of the board, and just stop you from killing them. So having a way to draw cards while also giving all of your other units an extra attack, kind of like what was this called? I forgot, the Heroism 3-cost red 3 that buffed up all of Sabine's units when they were playing it. Very strong effect. Definitely key card. You want it in your hand as fast as possible. Ideal turn 1 play. Next up, we're going to look at Sith Trooper. This unit gets +1/+0 on attack for each damaged enemy unit the defending player controls. Decent effect. 3-cost 3/3 is slightly below average. On attack, if they have even just one unit, it's attacking for 4. I don't know if 4/3 would be worth it for 3. If we, after reading all the cards, if we see that there's a lot of ways to damage our opponent's units, maybe. We'll come back to this. Finally, we have Captain Phasma as a unit herself. When played and on attack, you may give another first order unit +2/+2 for this phase. That is a very strong effect. And on top of that, considering that she is a 5-cost unit, she can come into play the same turn that Captain Phasma herself can, which means you can deploy the leader, buff it up. Apologies. You get to play this, give your Phasma Leader +2/+2, and attack with it, deal a bunch of damage. But considering this is when played and on attack, if we find a way to give this ambush, you get to give something +4/+4, or give 2 things +2/+2. Very strong effect, and not only are you buffing something to do extra damage, this is a 5/6 for 5, very good stats. It needs to be dealt with, or it's going to continuously add extra damage to the board. Now, before we move on, we just mentioned that giving this ambush would be a great thing. And considering that we are a more aggressive deck that cares a bit less about base health, I think this would be a great time to maybe take a look at our base, change it up into Energy Conversion Lab. Energy Conversion Lab says play a unit cost 6 or less from your hand, give it ambush for this phase. So on the turn 5, when you get to deploy Phasma as a 4/6, you get to Energy Conversion Lab the other Phasma into their unit. So not only do you get to potentially get rid of one of their units, your leader is now in an 8/10 that additionally when attacking will activate, because this is first order. Very powerful move. If you manage to pull it off properly, it is very hard for someone to come back from that. Next up, the last ground unit that we have is Kylo Ren. We can ignore the first part. We're not playing Rey. On attack, give a unit +2/+0. If it's a non-villain unit, also give an experience token to it. At the moment, we don't really have any non-villain units, so we can ignore the experience aspect of it. But on attack, giving something +2/+0 is very similar to Captain Phasma. And his stats alone are pretty good at 6/7. A very important thing to note is if you didn't actually use your Energy Conversion Lab on Captain Phasma, Kylo Ren himself can come down and you can give the +2/+0 to himself, unlike Phasma. That can ambush in for 8, which is pretty much 95% of the leaders that deploy on ground. You can completely deny them their leader, and most of the time when a leader is defeated on the same action that they are deployed, it puts that player so far behind. That is a very strong play, something to keep in mind. Now let's move over on to space. We have a first order TIE Fighter. If you control a token unit, this unit gets raid 1. Pretty good, 2/1 for 1. Average stats. The raid 1 is a nice bonus to have if we find ways to create tokens. Next up, ways to create tokens. So we have Kijimi Patrollers, 2-cost 1/1. When played, create a TIE Fighter token. I mean, you're paying 2 to get 2/2 in stats, which is not great, but it is split into 2 bodies, which has some potential, especially with pilots this set. And it does create a TIE Fighter token, which you want for your first order TIE Fighter that we spoke about earlier. Then we have Kylo's TIE Silencer, 2-cost 3/2, prime stats for a space unit for 2, and also prime stats for an aggressive deck. You want to do as much damage as possible, as fast as possible. So you want something that has more power than health, and 2 cost 3/2 is good. It also has the added benefit of being able to be played from your discard if it was discarded this turn. So it's like a small counter, I guess, to any hand hate decks, which I believe we will be seeing quite a bit of in this set. Next up, we have the Special Forces TIE Fighter, 2 cost 2/3. Let's take a better look at it. When played, if an opponent controls more space units than you, ready this unit. Stat lines are pretty average. It's not as aggressively statted as Kylo's TIE Silencer, but the ability saying that it can come in ready if your opponent has... I mean, basically, if you have no spaceships and your opponent has 2, it can come in ready. Not to be disregarded. Honestly, if you can bring this in when their units are tapped already, it comes in ready, kind of like Millennium Falcon, and then you get to even put a pilot on it, do some surprise damage. Very strong effect. Next up, we have the TIE Dagger Vanguard, 3 cost 2/2. Not the best stats. However, when played, you may deal 2 damage to a damaged unit. So if you played something on turn 1 and they managed to trade with it because you didn't have the initiative, so they managed to kill your unit before you dealt damage with it, you can just drop this down and get rid of whatever they used to kill your unit. It lets you win back the board while also putting a threat in play. Pretty good card. And finally, our last space unit that we have so far is Von Rex TIE Interceptor. 3 cost, 3/4, with 2 separate effects. While this unit has 4 or more power, it gains Overwhelm. Not bad. And then while this unit has 6 or more power, it gains Raid 1. So from what we've seen so far, this deck doesn't have many ways to add power to Von Reg. Of course, you have General Hux, which will give it Raid 1, which will immediately trigger him having Overwhelm. That said, I doubt you'll be hitting into units very often in this deck. You want to be hitting the base as much as possible. Okay. Now that we have a basic core, we need to see what we need to round out the deck. So since we are playing red green, generally you're going to choose to lean into one of the 2 colors. If we lean a bit more into the red side, that means we want to be more aggressive, we want to be faster, we want to kill our opponent before they get to do their big fancy plays. Of course, we don't want to see their 7, 8, 9 costs, because generally speaking, their big units will be better than ours. Alternatively, we could lean into the green side, go a bit more rampy. We could play some resupply, some super laser technicians, and then play some big guys like devastators and stuff. Those are both good options, I think, for this, because we're trying to build a more aggressive deck, because it's still early in the meta. We want to be killing people before they can do what they want to do. We're going to lean a bit more into the red. So let's take a look at what our options are, what our deck is missing, what our curve looks like. Let's go over each of these one by one. So first things first is our curve. All right, we're back. Apologies for that. So if we take a look at our curve, we get to see we at the moment seem to have quite a few 2 costs. So our turn 1 plays are already set in stone. We normally want at least 12. If we're playing a more aggressive deck, maybe we want something closer to 15. At the moment, it looks like we have 15 2 costs and 6 1 costs. That's pretty good. I don't think we need to add too much more of that. We're doing okay on the 3 costs. We can maybe add 1 more. We have nothing in the 4. We'll take a look at that. And of course, 5, 6. We don't want to add too many of them, but we do need we do need a couple at least, because if some decks manage to hold off our early aggression, we need some way to stay in the game and not immediately concede. So let's take a look at some of our synergies. So the first thing, one of the first things we're going to take a look at is here. This says while you control a token unit. While as we saw, there's only 1 token unit, that we have only 1 token generator in this deck, and it is the Kijimi Patrollers. So we're going to need at least one other way to create a token to get that online. And considering we have quite a few ships and well, it's a set of pilots, let's take a look at what we have as options for pilots. So we're going to go ahead and filter over here. We're going to look at pilots. All right. We already saw the conscript 1, 2. Still not sure about that. We're going to go down, and okay, we're going to stop right here. We notice that this guy says that when played as an upgrade, create a TIE Fighter token. That's exactly what we want. So you can play this as either a 3/2 on the ground, which is another turn 1 play. good stats, like we mentioned for the First Order TIE Fighter. He is not First Order, unfortunately, but considering that on turn 1 you get to play the First Order TIE Fighter and then immediately equip him with Wingman Victor 2 because it only costs 1 to pilot, immediately create a TIE Fighter token, you've made a very strong board. That would leave you with a 3-2 that has raid 1, so basically a 4-2 and a 1-1 in space. That's very hard for your opponent to deal with unless they have I don't know. There's not much at the moment that can deal with both of those all at once. So that is something to keep in mind. So let's go ahead and add 3 of these. Let's take a look at what other pilot options we have. So in these colors, there's not much in terms of powerful pilots that are aggressively statted. We do have the Determined Recruit that gives +3/+1. That is something to keep in mind. It's not too bad. We could definitely add the Indoctrinated Conscript. Like we said, +1/+2 is not great. However, it is First Order, so even if you play him as a pilot, you get to trigger Phasma because Phasma doesn't need you to play a unit, it just needs you to play a First Order card. And then finally, we're going to take a look at Darth Vader. Darth Vader is a 3-cost pilot, gives +3/+3. It says, when you play him as a pilot, attached unit gains on attack. You may deal 1 damage to a unit. If you defeat it that way, you may deal 1 damage to another unit or a base. Very strong effect. 3 cost 3/3 is pretty good when considering it's an upgrade that gets to basically use its power, use its attack in the same turn. That is a very strong effect. And another thing to think about is that, yes, this is a this is not only a pilot, this is also a ground unit that can be played as a 6-cost 7/7. And considering we are playing Energy Conversion Lab, well, you get to ambush this in because it costs 6. It's a very strong card in general. I don't think it's necessary in this deck, but I think it has just enough synergy with what we have, because if on turn 1 we get to play in one of our spaceships, if we get to play in our TIE Fighter or our TIE Silencer, turn 2 we can immediately equip it with Darth Vader. Let's go ahead and put a couple in here, see how this goes. All right, next up we're going to take a look at well, what kind of events do we want? And of course we are playing Green Villainy, and Green Villainy has one event that has been in every single Green Villainy deck. I don't think I need to say much about it, and we're talking about Overwhelming, I don't know how to write, Overwhelming Barrage. So Overwhelming Barrage, give a friendly unit +2/+2 for this phase, and then deal damage equal to its power divided as you choose. Yes, this might be considered removal for some, but honestly, in any deck, even if you're playing an aggressive deck, being able to play this on turn 5, making one of your units bigger, dealing with what they already have on the board, maybe removing a Sentinel, or maybe removing a unit that they were going to use to slow you down. Honestly, this card should be in every single green deck. Other events to consider, you can go through them all one by one. You can filter here by event, you can filter here by set. So if we look at, let's say, Jump To Lightspeed, because we know that this is going to be a very space focused set, there's probably quite a few events here that could help you out. Let's go ahead and take a look at some of the more on point ones. We have Shoot Down. It has good potential in an aggressive deck like ours. Deal 3 damage to a space unit. If that unit is defeated this way, deal 2 damage to a base. It's pretty good. Can definitely deal with your opponent's turn 1 plays and deal 2 damage to the base at the same time. Keep the pressure going. You can definitely put this in. I mean, I don't see why not. Let's go ahead and put it in. Other options that we have, of course, we have things like Stay on Target that'll not only do more damage to their base, but also draw you cards to keep the aggression going. Then, of course, you can take a look at Piercing Shot to deal with anything that's shielded. Defeat the shields, deal 3 damage. These are all honestly good options if you're against a deck that has a lot of ground units. You can definitely use air superiority, so that way even if they're leaving you alone in space, they're trying to lane dodge you, well, you get to kill something for 2. I mean, 4 damage is quite a bit. It'll kill almost anything that's played before turn 3, turn 4. Something to definitely consider. You can definitely take a look and go for more events, but usually when you're playing a more aggressive deck like this, you want less events and you want more units. So now we're going to take a look at some of the costs that we were missing in our curve. So we need some 4 costs, we need some 5 costs, maybe some 6 costs. Let's see what we have. Actually, 5 costs, we already have 6 between Phasma and Overwhelming Rush. We might be good. We have a good couple of 6s as well. Let's start by looking at the 4 costs. So for 4 costs, considering we're leaning a bit more on the space side at the moment, due to how this meta is most likely going to shake out, a key card that will be in space, that will be used as a 4 cost, of course, will be, where is it? We have the option of TIE Ambush Squadron, which could go pretty well in this deck as a 4 cost 2/3. When played and when defeated, create a TIE Fighter token. So you can come in, ambush something for 2. You can create a token which will buff up potentially your first order TIE Fighter. Pretty good card to consider maybe. But honestly, for 4 costs, because we're also playing red, we have the extremely powerful Imperial Interceptor. As we mentioned earlier, 3/2 is good stats for a 2 cost. However, this as a 4 cost not only has those same stats, but on play gets to deal 3 damage to another space unit. Honestly, putting a unit down that also deals with the unit that your opponent has in play is a very powerful move. Not only did you get rid of their play, but they also now have to deal with yours. It's a pretty big swing if you manage to pull it off. So I would definitely put 3 of these in here. There's nothing wrong with switching it out for TIE Ambush Squadron, especially if you lean even more into space dominance. And if you do, there are quite a few cards in this current set that will help you out. Best example would be, of course, if you check out Victor Leader. Victor Leader says each other friendly space unit gets +1/+1. If you lean more into the token generation in space, well, the TIE Ambush Squadron is now also attacking for 3. So definitely a path that you could go down. I opted not to at the moment, but that is what it is. So now we're going to take a look a bit at what happened to our curve. Okay, at least we have 1 4 cost. That's not too bad. But of course, before we even start finalizing things, we're gonna take a look at some of the very powerful key cards that are usually played in these colors. Some would call them staples. And I believe that any red villainy deck should absolutely be playing Ruthless Raider. So Ruthless is, as most of you know, is a 6 cost 4/6, decent stats that says when played and when defeated, deal 2 damage to the enemy base and deal 2 damage to an enemy unit. Very strong card for the same reason that we said the Interceptor was strong. However, this also deals damage to the base, and your opponents hate to get rid of it because that's another 4 damage that you're dealing to their side, and it's just really sticky card, and whether they deal with it or not, you're just hitting them very hard. And if they're trying to stabilize by turn 5 or 6 and you plop this down, maybe even 2 of these since they're not unique, you can just outright win the game because there's not much they can do about it. Let's go ahead and plop 3 of those down. And finally, I think the highest that this deck should go is 7, maximum 8 if the 8 cost is extremely powerful. And of course, since we're playing green villainy, we have our boy Vader, not in space. We have Darth Vader commanding the First Legion. So 7 costs, 5/7 with ambush. When played, search the top 10 cards, play any villainy units with a combined cost of 3 or less, and play them for free. Now, why does this make sense in our deck? Well, first of all, it's a strong card because it gets to come in, defeat something, leave a body behind, and bring another body in. But a key thing to note is that body that you're bringing in, because it's costing 3 or less, or you might even be playing 2 things, well, I think almost every single unit that we have that costs 3 or less is first order. So it's a way of considering that Darth Vader himself is practically first order because he's bringing something in, enabling Phasma. Very strong card. I would never recommend playing a green villainy deck without him. However, there's the caveat that if for some reason this meta is completely space focused, if nobody's playing on the ground, which is unlikely, this card could see some less use. So unlike previous sets, I believe that Darth Vader would be one of the cards that you would consider sideboarding versus some decks in this case, if they have nothing to ambush on the ground. Something to note. So I think that's pretty much a good core. We're up to 56 cards. Another notable mention, two notable mentions I'm going to give. We don't normally want to go as high as 8 cost in an aggressive deck. There are 2 cards that have, I guess, honorable mention. So in this set, we have the new legendary called Devastator. Well, he's 8 cost, sure, but on play, gets to deal 4 indirect damage to your opponent. However, you get to choose where it goes. What makes this card extremely strong is that, well, for one, as soon as you come in, you get to kill something. Same reasoning as the Interceptor. But then there's a 9/6 in play that your opponent needs to deal with. And if they can't, which is, I mean, likely because you just dealt 4 damage and potentially got rid of something that they already had on the board, well, if they can't kill it, they're taking 9 to the base next turn, which will usually seal the deal. Definitely playable, something to consider. And a second option, of course, is Count Dooku. Whoopsie. Count Dooku that we got in the previous set. Exploit 2. Exploit is not bad, especially if you're leaning more into the token builds, or considering that we have a lot of low-cost units that are not particularly powerful. You get to play this for a lot cheaper than you'd expect. If you manage to exploit 2 cards, if you've played a Kajimi Patrollers on turn 1 or 2, you get to bring this in for 4 cost and deal some damage along the way. So not only do they have a 6/6 overwhelm body that they need to deal with, but you potentially dealt damage on play. Same reasoning as a lot of the other cards like Interceptor that we said. Pretty strong card, definitely keep in mind. I'd say that then again, playing all of these, playing Dooku's and Devastators would definitely lean the deck a bit more on the heavy side, and we don't want to be getting to those late turns usually. These are more of like a insurance policy. So playing either Dooku or Devastator is not a bad call. So I think personally, because I believe space will be more important, I would put in a couple of Devastators just to see what it feels like. Now that said, our curve is looking a bit more decent. We have some plays at every level. We are a bit high on the 2 costs, but that's not the end of the world considering we are a pretty aggressive deck. So we're going to go over some of our cards now. We are at 58 cards, so we do need to shave off 8 of them. Yes, you're allowed to play more than 50 cards, but why would you? Why would you play 58 cards if you can take out 8 of your worst cards and have an even better deck? All right, so if we go down this list, one of the things we said we're going to keep an eye on earlier was the Sith Trooper. So damaged enemy units, well, we don't seem to have a lot of ways to do that. Of course, we have the First Order Stormtrooper that deals potentially indirect damage. Same goes with General Pride. But most of the time, especially this early on in the game, your opponents will be putting that on the base. So having the Sith Trooper out, I don't think this will be getting the buff very often. And if it doesn't get the buff, just a 3 mana, just a 3 resource, 3/3, probably not worth playing, so we're going to go ahead and take that out. I don't think we need other pilots, so we're going to go ahead and take the Indoctrinated Conscript out of the sideboard. We'll talk about the sideboard later. And then, honestly, at this point, what to cut is entirely your choice. I would go down the list one by one, choosing. And if I'm doing that, for me, I think one of the things I would cut here would be Shoot Down. I don't believe we need the extra space damage, mainly because we have so many ways of dealing with enemy space problems, such as, of course, we have the Vanguard, we have the Interceptor, we have Devastator if we ever get there, Ruthless Raider, and honestly, most of the time, your opponent will be trading into your units anyways, because you are the aggressor. So I think we can definitely put this down into the sideboard. It's not a bad card. I just don't think that we currently need it. And at this point, we need to cut a couple of cards. And because we saw that we are pretty heavy on the 2 costs, maybe we can cut a couple of the low drops. That is entirely your call what you would like to cut. You can potentially cut honestly any of these other than General Hux is acceptable to go. Just for the sake of this video, let's go ahead and cut, what would I cut here? I guess I would cut 1 Stormtrooper here and maybe even 1 First Order TIE Fighter. We don't need that many 1 costs, especially considering that our Wingman Victor 2 is essentially a 1 cost because you get to play it as an upgrade. So just something to note. That is pretty flexible. That's going to depend entirely on your playstyle. But all right, so let's go ahead and save this and take a look at what we've created. So a good way to do that is that once you have saved this, of course, you get to look at the deck image here. If it loads. All right. Obviously, we don't have much in the sideboard because the sideboard is something that you can't really create without knowing what you are going against. Sideboard is there to kind of like plug in the weaknesses of your deck based on what meta you're against. Something to consider is the token package that we spoke about earlier. If you absolutely want to have even more space dominance, you can put in Wake Their Leader here. You can put in more pilots. You can put in the TIE Ambusher if you want. That way, if you're playing versus a space-only deck, you can take out some of those low-cost ground units that you have and put in more space. Or you can put in even more low-cost aggressive stuff. If you think that you're against a deck that won't even let you get to 7 or 8, you can definitely take out the Dark Vaders and Devastators, put in more early aggression. You can definitely put in the Death Star Stormtroopers and just overwhelm your opponent very quickly. All viable options. Of course, we forgot to change the name here. Beige Wonder Woman. Not very important. So if we take a look at this deck, before we end the video, let's talk a bit about what its strengths and weaknesses are, what its goal is that we kind of alluded to in the beginning. We didn't specifically dive into it, but that's right. We are playing an aggressive deck. Our goal is to just beat our opponent down as fast as possible. We want to make it so that every single turn we are playing something that makes them go, I have to get rid of that. Because otherwise, if you give them some breathing room and they establish some board presence, our overall lower stats will not let us win the board back. So we want to always be the one putting the problems into play, always be the one that's the aggressor. And our key turn in this deck is going to be the 5 resource turn. A lot of the time it is the leader deploy turn for most decks, but it's even more important in this deck because if you've managed to put in a bit of damage early on with your low-cost units, getting Phasma out, being able to ECL out another Captain Phasma, by ECL I mean of course Energy Conversion Lab, and dishing out upwards of 10 to 12 damage in that one turn is enough usually to seal the deal. And if they don't, you just come in with the Ruthless Raiders and just end it. So that is the main strength of the deck. And what are the weaknesses? Well, we see we don't have too much removal, especially for if your opponent manages to lane dodge you. So if you're playing against something aggressive like a Sabine, if they go entirely on the ground while you're in the space, we don't seem to currently have any ways to deal with that. So that's something else to consider in the sideboard, maybe with some air superiority. Alternatively, we don't have ways to deal with restore bodies. So if we're playing against blue heroism, of course there's the Yodas, the Kanans, they could potentially just out heal our early aggressive damage. That's something to keep in mind. Of course, no deck is ever going to be amazing versus everything. So the part of deck building is noticing what your deck is strong against, what it is weak against, and whether it's worth plugging that difference. Of course, we could change this deck around so we are better versus those heroism heal decks, but then we would be weaker versus others. That's just how TCGs work. So understanding your own weaknesses is very important to know what decks you can easily beat and which ones you need to actually pivot or play differently against. That is a whole other topic that we're not going to get into today. All right. That said, thank you very much, everybody, for listening to our first installment of our deck building guides. And thank you very much. I hope you all have a great day. If you guys have any feedback or suggestions, or if you have any, if you want another leader done next, my plan is to definitely get through everything that is in set 4 and maybe even some older leaders that I believe have great potential in this set. Leave a comment. Tell me what you're interested in, what kind of videos you want to see, and it would be my pleasure to get to it. So once again, thank you everyone, and I hope to see you next time.